News of the Times. The St Mellons Mystery. The Murder of Susan Gibbs. True Crime from 1874. 1874, Wales. Tonight we step into one of the most unsettling Victorian mysteries ever to unfold in Wales. In the spring of 1874, a well-liked woman vanished after receiving a handwritten note from her husband, a young butler at the grand Llanrumney Hall. 3 weeks later, her body was discovered hidden beneath a tangle of briars in a lonely St Mellons ditch, so decomposed that even the cause of death was uncertain. Was it a gunshot? Was her throat cut? Or had something far stranger happened in those missing hours? What followed became a landmark investigation in early forensic history, a case built almost entirely on behaviour, deception and the quiet but devastating power of circumstantial evidence. It is a story of a missing wife, a secret life and a servant's ambition that may have turned deadly. This is the St Mellons mystery. The murder of Susan Gibbs in 1874, a Victorian true crime that shocked every household from Cardiff to Newport and still reveals how fragile justice could be in an age before modern science. And in today's end of episode further particular segment, we depart from murder entirely and enter the realm of Victorian chaos, this time starring a parrot with more confidence than sense. In 1874, St Mellons was the kind of parish where time seemed to move a little more gently than in the growing towns around it. Narrow lanes stitched the fields together, sunk deep between banks of bramble and hawthorn, their earth packed hard by the boots of farmhands and the hooves of passing carts. In the early mornings, a thin Welsh mist clung low across the meadows, softening the hedgerows and blurring the distant silhouettes of cottages with their thin, twisting chimneys. At the edge of this quiet landscape stood Llanrumney Hall, a handsome, many-windowed house of pale stone, long accustomed to privilege. Its gravelled drive curved in from the lodge on the main road, leading to a great front door where visitors were greeted by the sight of polished brass, formal order and the brisk precision of a Victorian household. Inside, the butler kept a tight hold on propriety, the silver laid, the schedules observed, the wine decanted, and the small rituals of respectability upheld without fail. Yet for all its elegance, the hall was surrounded by pockets of deep rural seclusion. Just beyond its grounds were rougher paths leading down toward the marshier fields, places where a person might walk unseen, where sheep grazed quietly, and where the hedges grew thicker enough to swallow an entire ditch from sight. It was in this gentle, outwardly peaceful corner of Victorian Wales that a small accidental discovery made by a farmer searching for a missing sheep would break the calm and draw the eyes of the entire district to a tragedy hidden beneath the brambles. From the South Wales Daily News, the 4th of June 1874, a revolting murder has been committed in the parish of St Mellons near Cardiff. Yesterday, a farmer found in a ditch the dead body of a woman frightfully decomposed. She has been identified as Susan Gibbs, wife of James Gibbs, the butler at Llanrumney Hall, which is situated about a quarter of a mile from the place where the body was discovered. The marks show that death had been caused by a gunshot or by the throat having been cut. Suspicion attaches to her husband, who is in custody because At his written request, she had left Cardiff, where she lived, and had gone to see him 3 weeks ago. She was never seen alive again, and her husband was out till 1 o'clock in the morning after her visit to him. Before we continue, should this already feel more intriguing than a ticket to see Houdini himself, you're very welcome to tap the thumbs up or anything nearby that suggests promise. Many thanks for the support. Now, we step back to 1874, where a stray sheep uncovered the first clue in a most sinister affair. To understand how this tragedy unfolded, we must look first at the people at its centre, a vulnerable woman longing for recognition and a husband living a double life. Susan Ann Gibbs, or Susan Gibbs. Susan Ann Gibbs was a woman who, by every account, lived her life with quiet industry and unassuming gentleness. By the time she met James Gibbs in the early 1870s, she was already nearing 40, a respectable, steady presence in domestic service, valued for her reliability, her religious disposition, and a mind described by acquaintances as refined and cultivated for her station. Her life had not been an easy one. Work as a cook and a housekeeper demanded long hours, and she was often so exhausted she could scarcely rise the next morning. Yet she carried herself with modest pride, faith, and a deep hunger, perhaps long suppressed, for affection. When she first met the young footman, James Henry Gibbs, barely 19, the disparity in their ages, a full 20 years, was remarked upon even then, although she likely felt it less than anyone. For Susan, who had never married and who had lived her adult life in service, the attention of a handsome, attentive youth must have seemed a blessing she scarcely believed she deserved. Newspapers later observed that she loved not wisely but too well, and it is clear that she poured into him an intensity of affection that left her heartbreakingly vulnerable. Even on the last night of her life, she told friends she was certain he meant to recognize their marriage at last. And so, in the spring of 1874, Susan travelled once more to meet her husband, certain he would finally acknowledge her. James Henry Gibbs presented at first glance as a Victorian success story, a delicate but clever boy who rose steadily from errand boy to footman and finally to butler at Llanrumney Hall. In his early youth, nothing marked him as dangerous or cruel. He received commendations, good references, and the approval of several employers. But beneath that surface lay ambition and, crucially, a profound fear of being socially diminished. When he met Susan Ingram, he was 19, she 39. The age gap was well known amongst servants and later the wider public, who viewed the match as strange and entirely unsuited to a man who dreamed of climbing society's domestic ranks. Though Gibbs willingly entered the secret marriage at St Helier in Jersey, he almost immediately regretted it. By then, he had developed a taste for admiration and had begun courting Miss Mary Jones, a young woman of his own age in St Mellons, whose parents accepted him as a future husband. To Jones and to everyone in the village, he denied being married at all. From this point, Gibbs's character darkened. He became a habitual liar, weaving stories so persistent that even his colleagues placed no trust in him. He treated Susan with increasing cruelty, took her money, and refused to be seen publicly with her. To Miss Jones, he presented himself as a bachelor. To Susan, he swore oaths on his knees that he was not courting another woman. His behaviour in the days before the murder shows a man under mounting pressure, torn between ambition, fear of exposure, and the desire to rid himself of the marriage that constrained his social prospects. His note summoning Susan to a late-night meeting, his threats, and his attempts to hide her existence from everyone at Llanrumney Hall illustrate a man whose moral compass had been thoroughly eroded long before the crime. By 1874, Gibbs was balancing lies on all sides, and the life he wanted could only be achieved if Susan and the marriage certificate proved their union disappeared. By the time Susan set out for St Mellons that final week, everything in James Gibbs's life was tightening around him. From the South Wales Daily News, the 4th of June, 1874. Horrible murder outside Cardiff. The apprehension of the supposed murderer. One of the most cruel and cold-blooded murders which has been recorded in the history of this or the adjoining county is now, by the efforts of the police, being brought to light, and which, but for accidental circumstance, might have remained undiscovered for a long time. The Llanrumney estate near Cardiff is partly tenanted by a farmer named John Hughes, who occupies many acres of ground for sheep pasture. Early on Wednesday morning, he went round his farm to ascertain if any sheep had been missed. He believed that he had lost one, and this induced him to extend his walk to the more secluded parts of the estate. One side of a ditch on the estate is protected by a hedge, and the other side is covered with briars, which have grown for years, and that they entirely conceal the ditch from view. A man could enter at the lower end and walk in a stooped position for several yards under the mass of briars overhead. The farmer, in passing here, noticed a putrid smell rising from the ditch, and thinking that it was possibly the carcass of a sheep, he went to examine it. Pushing the brambles aside, he saw what he believed to be a woman's dress. He hastened round to the other side, and there saw the body of a woman in such a state of decomposition as to render it loathsome to look at, and equally horrifying to the sense of smell. He ran at once to the farm and dispatched a messenger to St Mellons for a police constable, and he at once sent for Inspector Shepherd of the Monmouth Constabulary at Newport. The inspector arrived shortly, and under his direction the briars were removed and a stretcher was brought, on which the body, though with considerable difficulty, was placed. When found, it was lying on its back with its head to the lower part of the ditch. It had on a merino dress, and under the head was a waterproof cloak. The body was in such a putrid condition, being almost eaten up with vermin, that it required the utmost care to lift it, and in doing so the head was almost severed from the body. There was no bonnet or hat on the head. A bruise was on the left hand, and her right hand had also been injured. The third finger of the left hand had been cut, and the rings taken off. There was nothing in the pocket, and the boot and the stockings had been removed from the left foot and leg. As soon as the body was removed to the farmhouse, inquiries were made so that the body might be identified. Rumours of a very unpleasant character had been for some weeks circulated respecting a young man named James Gibbs, a butler at the Hall. Gibbs, for some years since, lived at Wainbridge, New Reading, where he formed an acquaintance with a woman. She was at one time cook and then lady's maid to a family in the neighbourhood. She was well educated and ladylike in appearance. In June last, he obtained permission from Mr. G. Williams to take a fortnight's holiday, and he went to London and induced this woman, whose name was Susan Ingram, to go with him to Jersey, her native place, where they were to be married. He returned to Cardiff and left her at the residency of Mrs. Mahoney, Dispensary Court in Walking Street, while he returned to his service. At times he used to visit her at her lodgings and occasionally send her to meet him at Penlan, where he would go also to meet her. In his visits to her at Cardiff, he seldom strayed more than a few hours during the daytime, and always made some excuse for not stopping longer. His wife had some money in the bank, a portion of which she often gave to him, while she worked hard at cooking and cleaning to maintain herself. Monday morning, Susan received a note from him telling her to meet him at the old spot on Tuesday evening, and to bring with her a night dress, as she would not return home that evening. She left home at about 6 o'clock, and nothing was heard of her until the body was found on Wednesday morning, some 3 weeks after her departure. Mrs. Mahoney, Susan's landlady, grew increasingly uneasy at her continued absence. Gibbs visited her several times after Susan left, always with an explanation at the ready. Over the following fortnight he sent a series of letters written in his own hand, but claiming to speak for both himself and his wife, assuring Mrs. Mahoney that Susan was merely poorly and that they were planning to travel, and that she was not to write to him at the Hall. In one note he wrote, "The missus wished me to write. She is very poorly, but intends going to Newport to start. We think we shall be away next week for certain." In another signed J. and S. Gibbs, he asked Mrs. Mahoney to pack a few of Susan's belongings, promising he would collect them. True to his word, Gibbs called at the lodgings, brought Susan's keys, opened her boxes, removed certain items, and locked them again. When asked directly whether Susan was at the Hall, he laughed and replied, "No, but she's all right." The letters continued into late May, each one insisting she remained unwell, each one promising a return next week, each one postponing that return by another few days. In his final note, dated the 29th of May, he claimed to have received a letter from Susan herself, stating she would be back the following day and that he was going to meet her. None of it was true. By this time, Susan had already been dead for weeks. When Susan did not come, Mrs. Mahoney made inquiries but could not find anything until the policeman came to her on Wednesday morning and drove her over to St Mellons. She could not recognise the body, but a handkerchief in the pocket of the deceased was marked with her name, S. Ingram. Gibbs was at once taken into custody, and when told the charge, denied all knowledge of it. He was, however, removed in custody to Newport jail. The finger which had been cut had on it her wedding ring and a large ring given by her brother, which she wore as a keeper, and these, it is thought, will within the letters lead to some facts connected with the murder. Although the deceased went to Penlan on Tuesday evening, she did not stay at St Mellons. No one saw her, but Gibbs did not return home till 1 o'clock on Wednesday morning. Dr. Lowhawk examined the body in the afternoon of yesterday and found marks of blood on the front of her dress. The body was in such an advanced state of decomposition that he could not say what was the cause of death. The windpipe had been entirely eaten away, although there were appearances that would indicate that the throat was cut. It is conjecture that he first stunned her by a blow, afterwards cut her throat, and then dragged the body through a gap which is now visible into the ditch. She was of that weak and nervous temperament that she would be very likely to offer much resistance. The only evidence of a struggle is that the boot of the left foot is gone. A post-mortem examination of the body will be made, and the inquiry opened today at St Mellons. News of the discovery spread rapidly, and throughout the day hundreds of curious onlookers made their way to the spot. By evening, the body had been secured in a locked outbuilding on the estate pending the formal inquest. The discovery of Susan's body sent a shock through the district, and the police wasted no time in treating the case with the utmost seriousness. As officers pieced together her final days, one name rose again and again: James Gibbs. His secret life, his concealed marriage, and his attentions to a younger woman formed a pattern investigators could not ignore. At the time of his arrest, Gibbs, a slight, fair-complexioned man of 25, showed scarcely any emotion when the charge was put to him. From the South Wales Daily News, the 6th of June, 1874, the horrible murder near Cardiff. Additional particulars. The various links in the chain of circumstantial evidence are often picked up slowly, and as one theory respecting the cause of the death of the murdered woman, Mrs. Gibbs, is succeeded by another, the evidence is only of value as it supports the one supposition or the other. At present, the only person suspected of causing her death is her husband, James Gibbs, and as every day brings to light some fresh facts, they all seem to carry conviction that he was the person who committed the foul crime. His unhappy familiarity with Miss Jones led to frequent upbraiding from the deceased, although she loved him to such an extent that she frequently hung on to him when at Cardiff and begged with tears in her eyes that he would discontinue all acquaintances with Miss Jones. On the day prior to the Saturday when he was in Cardiff, and when the deceased went with him to Penlyon, he was heard to threaten her if she came to St Mellons. On the Tuesday evening when Susan left Cardiff for the last time, she stopped briefly at the home of Mrs. Wilson, the wife of a borough constable. Susan told her she felt a heavy dread about the meeting ahead, remarking how strange it was that Gibbs, who often went a month without seeing her, had sought her out on Friday, again on Saturday, and now a third time on Tuesday. Mrs. Wilson noticed that Susan still wore both her rings as she departed. At Llanrumney Hall, Gibbs had been unusually gloomy for several days, enough that the coachman quietly watched his movements. That Tuesday night he left the hall and did not return until well after 1 in the morning. When he did arrive, he appeared greatly agitated, went directly to his room and paced there for hours, only lying down around 6 o'clock when the other servants began to rise. By Friday, Inspector Shepherd reached Cardiff and took charge of the investigation. Susan's boxes, along with one belonging to Gibbs, had already been secured at the police station. As the police began examining the antecedents of everyone connected with the case, the picture grew steadily darker for James Gibbs. Each new inquiry, each witness statement, each recovered letter seemed to narrow the field rather than widen it. By the time the coroner opened the inquest, the investigation had already taken on a decidedly bleak aspect for the young butler. As the inquest opened on Saturday, further troubling evidence came to light. Mrs. Mahoney confirmed that Susan had placed her keys in her black bag before leaving Cardiff. Those same keys were later produced by Gibbs, who used them to open and search his wife's boxes after her disappearance. Witnesses further stated that since Susan vanished, Gibbs had been seen walking at night near the very place where the body was found. As the inquest continued, the evidence pointing towards James Gibbs grew more tightly connected. It was now widely stated that he had long been courting Miss Jones of St Mellons, assuring her that he was not married, a claim made more plausible by the marked difference in age between himself and Susan. Their intimacy was not fleeting. The pair had even spent several days together in London the previous Christmas, and the relationship continued until the very day he was taken into custody. A decisive fact emerged when it was revealed that on the Sunday after Susan left Cardiff, and it was generally believed the Sunday following her death, the banns of marriage between Gibbs and Miss Jones were publicly read at St Mellons Church. It was also alleged that when Gibbs returned to Cardiff after the murder and opened Susan's boxes with her own keys, he removed certain papers, among them the marriage certificate. While the documents had not been recovered, Mrs. Wilson had previously read it and will attest to its contents. Susan herself was remembered as a woman of gentle and religious temperament, well known among the congregation of St John's Church during her time in Cardiff. Miss Jones, through no fault of her own, is now unhappily involved in the matter and will be called as a witness. From the South Wales Daily News, the 8th of June, 1874. Then horrible murder near Cardiff. Further particulars. Inquest on the body of the murdered woman. Since the night of the supposed murder, Gibbs had been frequently seen walking near the spot where the body was found, and a supposition is gaining ground that he visited the body at night or sometime when not seen. On the morning after the murder, when he returned home, he had nothing with him, and yet her umbrella, the umbrella she carried with her when she left Cardiff, was found in the butler's pantry at the Hall. The black handbag that she took with her when she left on the Tuesday evening, and in which she placed the keys of her boxes at her lodgings in Cardiff, has not been found, but the keys have been. The articles of underclothing belonging to her, and for which he told Mrs. Mahoney his wife sent him on Friday week, were found in his boxes in the same state as she had given them to him. The brown straw hat which she wore, the boot and stocking from the left foot, have not been found, but the rings cut from her finger, it is said, have been. From the South Wales Daily News, 12th of June, 1874. Horrible murder near Cardiff. The examination of the prisoner before the magistrates at Newport. Further particulars. The excitement which has prevailed since the first disclosure of this dreadful murder was greatly heightened yesterday, when the prisoner, James Henry Gibbs, was brought before the county magistrates at Newport. Long before the court opened, the street in front of the hall was thronged with persons anxious to obtain a glimpse of the accused man, and the police experienced considerable difficulty in maintaining a passage from the cells to the court. Gibbs was conveyed from Usk jail early in the morning, and a little before 11 o'clock he was brought out, handcuffed to another prisoner. He was attired in a plain grey suit of the kind worn by servants when out of livery, and presented a pale and careworn appearance. His light hair, his whiskers and moustache only served to make more noticeable the sunken eyes and prominent cheekbones, betraying the agitation under which he laboured. The rush to see him was immense. The court, upon being opened, was filled to suffocation, while many, unable to gain admission, contented themselves by looking through the windows and over the raised sashes, much to the annoyance of the prisoner, and during the hearing of some minor cases, he sat in evident distress, wiping the perspiration from his brow and trembling visibly. His father, a hard-working man residing at Richmond in Surrey, was present, and when the handcuffs were removed, shook hands with his son whilst weeping bitterly. Gibbs appeared deeply affected, and when the charge was read, he stood only by holding the rail before him for support. At the request of his solicitor, Mr. Ensor, he was permitted to remain seated during the examination of the witnesses. Throughout the proceedings, his demeanour was quiet and respectful, although marked by a reserve occasionally disturbed when the excitement both within and outside the court obliged the police to interfere. The clerk to the magistrates, Mr. H. J. Davis, called him up. He said, "James Henry Gibbs, you are charged with the wilful murder of your wife, Susan Gibbs, on or about the 11th or 12th of May, 1874, in the parish of St Mellons." The prisoner made no answer. The first witness was Susan's landlady, Catherine Mahoney. She stated that Susan had taken the name Ingram because Gibbs's employer did not allow married servants, but she confided that James Gibbs was in fact her husband. He visited frequently and treated her as such. Mahoney described the 3 locked boxes Susan kept in her room and the small bunch of keys always used to open them. On the 12th of May, Susan left the house at around 6:30 with her umbrella, a waterproof cloak, and a small leather bag containing her nightdress and personal items. She locked her boxes, put the keys in the bag, and told Mahoney not to wait up if she was late. It was the last time she was seen alive. In the days that followed, Gibbs came to the lodgings 3 times. He opened Susan's boxes using keys he produced himself, removed a small parcel, and repeatedly claimed that his wife was very poorly. He took away several items of her underclothing, insisting she had asked for them, and said she had gone to Reading. He also sent letters to Mahoney, which she later turned over to the police. When the body was discovered on the 3rd of June, Mahoney's identified Susan by her clothing. At the ditch where the body had been found, she picked up a jet earring and a hairpin belonging to Susan. Additional fragments of a matching earring were found by a constable nearby. She also identified the glove, the brooch, and various pieces of clothing recovered from the body, many marked with Susan's initials, S.A. Ingram. Constable Hughes's evidence. Constable Charles Hughes was one of the first officers to reach the scene after a farmer reported a body in a ditch at Llanrumney farm. He explained that the ditch was so overgrown with fresh green briars that he could barely see the body until he cut the branches back. The brambles had formed an archway over the figure, completely concealing it from view. Once uncovered, he saw the body lying on its back, head pointing downhill towards a small opening in the ditch. The advanced decomposition made the cause of death difficult to judge, but Hughes believed the throat appeared to have been cut. The neck and upper chest were almost entirely destroyed by decay and insects, and the left hand was curled near the wrist, still gripping a short piece of bramble. Susan's waterproof cape lay beneath the head, partly buttoned, and her hair was loose and disarranged. Hughes did not move the body, but left it under guard while he summoned Inspector Shepherd. He noted that the brambles around the spot were so thick that no one could have entered from above. The only access was through a lower opening further down the ditch. There was no clear drag marks remaining, but Hughes believed the body must either have been dragged into position or placed there by someone crawling in and turning around. A narrow footpath ran close by, commonly used by locals fetching water from a nearby well. Constable Hughes continued. He also examined Susan's belongings at Mrs. Mahoney's house. 2 letters from Gibbs were found in the pocket of a dress she had left behind, confirming that she was still in regular contact with him up to the week of her disappearance. Additional letters were later recovered from Llanrumney Hall, including one found on the carriage drive, suggesting Gibbs had been corresponding under several different pretenses. Further physical evidence came from the field itself. A glove identified as Susan's was recovered near the ditch, and 8 yards away officers found a patch of turf stained with what appeared to be blood. Close to this were several hairpins, including one bent out of shape, and pieces of a broken earring matching the pair Susan wore when she left Cardiff. These discoveries supported the growing belief that the assault took place away from the ditch and that her body had been moved after death. Attention then shifted to Gibbs's own movements on the night of the 12th of May. If Susan never returned to Cardiff, where was her husband during those critical hours? The man best placed to answer was George Miles, the coachman who slept in the same room. George Miles said, "I'm a coachman at Llanrumney Hall. I sleep in the house. I remember Tuesday night, the 12th of May, prisoner was absent from the hall. Early on Wednesday morning at about 1:30, I was awoke by Gibbs calling Miles outside my bedroom window. I went down and let him in. When he came in, I said, 'Come on, old pal, this is a fine time to be about.' He said nothing, and I locked the door and went upstairs. He did not follow. He slept in the same room as I do. He came upstairs before I went to sleep. I woke up about 20 minutes past 5, but found that he had not been in bed. The clothes were turned half back, but the bed had not been slept in that night, nor was he in the room. I did not go to sleep again. At 5:45 he came upstairs. He had then his trousers, vest and shirt on. He had his boots in his hand. I think he hid his coat on his arm. He then undressed and went to bed. I did not speak to him, and very shortly afterwards I got up and left him in bed. He came down to breakfast at about 9 o'clock. The prisoner's relationship with Miss Jones, the prisoner, formed his acquaintance with the deceased while he was residing with the gentleman at Reading. After a short time, he and the deceased quarrelled, and Gibbs, hearing that Mr. Williams of Llanrumney Hall wanted a butler, came there. He soon formed an acquaintance with Miss Jones of St Mellons. One of the servants, going up to Reading, made the deceased acquainted with the fact that Gibbs was living at Llanrumney Hall. By some means the acquaintance was renewed, and in June last year, on obtaining a fortnight's holiday from his master, he went to Reading and then to Jersey, where he took the deceased and married her. He wanted to leave her in Jersey, but she refused and came on with him to Cardiff, and he left her at Mr. Elliott's Hotel in St. Mary's Street. He never said that he was married, but carried on his acquaintance with Miss Jones the same as before. The deceased afterwards moved to Mrs. Mahoney's dispensary court, where she stayed some time, and where Miles, the coachman, became aware that Gibbs was married to her. George Miles, the coachman at Llanrumney Hall, had long suspected that Gibbs was courting Miss Jones in St Mellons while keeping his marriage to Susan a secret. When he confirmed the rumours, he wrote directly to Susan to tell her what was happening behind her back. Her reply, later produced in court, made clear that she was indeed married to Gibbs and could prove it. She also hinted that his behaviour had finally driven her to take steps to set herself right, suggesting she intended to bring the matter into the open. When Susan next confronted Gibbs with the letter from Miles, he first denied it was the coachman's handwriting and then reportedly threatened to do something to Miles for interfering. In the days that followed, Susan tried repeatedly to approach Gibbs at Llanrumney Hall. She was seen near the fish pond by the cook and was observed sending a note into the house through the lodgekeeper. Signs that she was no longer willing to remain hidden and no longer willing to accept the secret life Gibbs was living at St Mellons. By now, the picture around James Gibbs was tightening sharply. His secret courting of Miss Jones, an entirely unsuspecting young woman, had come to light, and Susan had been warned of it by the coachman. Her repeated visits to Llanrumney Hall in the days before her disappearance placed Gibbs in a perilous position, threatening not only his post as a butler, but his standing in the community. All the while, he continued writing to her landlady, insisting that Susan was merely unwell, even as he made determined efforts to obtain the keys to her locked boxes, where her marriage certificate was believed to be kept. With these threads drawn together, the inquest was now edging towards its grim conclusion. From the South Wales Daily News, the 17th of June, 1874. The horrible murder near Cardiff. Conclusion of the inquest on the body. Verdict of wilful murder against the accused, James Henry Gibbs. The adjourned inquiry into this sad case was resumed at the Bluebell in St Mellons yesterday before Mr. W. H. Brewer, coroner. The excitement, which had been increasing for some days in the village, grew considerably yesterday when it was generally announced that the police would complete their case and the jury arrived at a decision as to the cause of the death of the deceased Susan Ann Gibbs. Work seemed to be almost entirely suspended, and from the early part of the morning groups of residents of the village clustered around the Bluebell, and others stood outside the doors of their houses watching the approach of the police and the various parties concerned in the inquiry. From the very first it appeared that the deceased was rendered insensible by a blow from some instrument while in the field by the side of the ditch, and that the body was then dragged into the ditch and the throat cut there. The police have as yet failed to find, and now probably never will, the instrument with which the deed was committed. The time that has elapsed, and did elapse, before the body was discovered, gave the murderer, whoever he was, ample time to put away any instrument he might have used for the purpose. The razor found by Sergeant Hale in the cigar box in the prisoner's pantry has marks upon it, but it would now be almost impossible to say they were marks of blood, and more especially human blood. The rings which were taken off the fingers of the deceased, the stocking, the boot, the bag with its contents, which she carried with her, have not been found, and the police are still engaged in their endeavours to find them. They had sufficient evidence to prove that the deceased met with a violent death, and also to show that the prisoner was the last seen with her alive. William Morgan, gamekeeper at Llanrumney Hall, said on the night of the 9th of May, James Gibbs and his supposed wife were standing together near the cover by the fish pond. She was talking very loudly and appeared to be scolding him. She had an umbrella which she waved backwards and forwards in a very excited manner. They remained there for 5 or 10 minutes, and all that time Mrs. Gibbs seemed to be scolding. Gibbs stood with his hands in his pockets but didn't say anything. The gate they were standing against was on the same ditch as to where the body was found, but about 100 yards below. He did not know that he was married, but I was told that he was, and it was also said that he was courting Miss Jones of Mellons. I have seen them together at the concert given at St Mellons on the 6th of May. I saw Gibbs and Miss Jones sitting side by side. I heard they were going to be married. It was common talk about the village. Miss Mary Jones, the young woman Gibbs had been courting in St Mellons, confirmed that he had been paying her addresses for nearly 2 years and had asked her to marry him. Their wedding was set for the following Saturday. She stated plainly that Gibbs had always represented himself as a single man, and although she had heard rumours that he might be married, he denied them, and she believed him. Samuel Shepherd said, I am an inspector of the Monmouth County Constabulary stationed at Newport. I had some boards put together and removed the body to a shed on the farm where it was seen by Dr. Lowhor. I then proceeded to Llanrumney Hall and I rang at the front door. The prisoner came to the door to answer it, and I asked him if his name was Gibbs. He said it was. I told him I wanted to speak to him, and he walked with him into the kitchen. I then and there told him that a woman had been found dead in a ditch that morning on the Llanrumney estate. The body of the woman had been identified as that of his wife. He said, My wife? I said, Yes, your wife, Susan Gibbs, who has been lodging at number 4 Dispensary Court and who has been missing from her lodgings since 3 weeks last Tuesday. I was going to apprehend you, and you must consider yourself in custody on the charge of her wilful murder. You need not say anything in answer to the charge, and if you do, I shall be obliged to take it down in writing and may give it in evidence against you. I afterwards told him that it was necessary that I should search his boxes and drawers. I went upstairs with him and searched his boxes and found nothing. On his person I found a bunch of keys, which he said belonged to his father, and that he kept them as a memorial of him. That same evening I took the prisoner to Newport in a cab. On Thursday the 14th I got him remanded and visited Llanrumney estate again, in company with Mr. Mackintosh and Sergeant Hale. Between 4 and 5 p.m. myself and Sergeant Hale visited Llanrumney Hall, and in the butler's pantry on the top of the cupboard I found this umbrella, which has been identified by Mrs. Wilson, which she states the deceased had her in her possession when she left Cardiff, and also a parcel of clothes containing a pair of stockings, a pair of female drawers, and a slip and a chemise marked S. Ingram. I took these articles and the umbrella to Mrs. Mahoney, and she identified the articles of clothing as having put them up and handed them to Gibbs some days after the 12th of May. The umbrella was identified by Mrs. Wilson. The body was in such a state of decomposition that it could not be expected that the medical men could state anything more than, judging from the saturated clothes, the blood issued from the neck. The jury consulted for about an hour and then returned a verdict of wilful murder against James Henry Gibbs, who was committed for trial in the usual manner at the next assizes. The trial of James Henry Gibbs opened on the 6th of August 1874 at the Monmouth Assizes before Mr. Justice Lush, drawing a crowd so large that the streets outside the town hall were reportedly packed long before proceedings began. Although no single piece of forensic evidence could point conclusively to murder, the Crown's case rested on a carefully assembled chain of circumstances which, when placed together, formed a deeply damning picture. The prosecution argued that Gibbs had lured his wife to St Mellons under false pretences, struck her insensible near the ditch, and then cut her throat before hiding the body beneath the briars. Their case focused not on scientific certainty impossible given the state of the remains, but on behaviour, his lies, his double life, his efforts to retrieve the keys, his destruction of papers, the burning of linen in his pantry stove, and his nightly movements near the place where the body lay undiscovered. Multiple witnesses testified to Gibbs' sustained pattern of deception. He denied being married while courting Mary Jones, arranged for their banns to be read days after his wife's disappearance, and reassured his true wife's landlady that Susan was simply poorly and travelling, even as he rifled through her locked boxes. The coachman, Miles, described Gibbs's returning to the hall in the early hours, agitated, sleepless, and with his bed conspicuously untouched. The defence could offer little beyond highlighting what wasn't found. No weapon, no clear medical cause of death, no eyewitnesses, and no definitive proof of when or how Susan died. But Victorian juries were accustomed to circumstantial cases, and the prosecution pressed the argument that only Gibbs had both opportunity and overwhelming motive, a motive rooted in social ambition, fear of exposure, and the desire to rid himself of an inconvenient wife. After a deliberation that reportedly lasted less than an hour, the jury returned a verdict of guilty. Gibbs remained calm as sentence was pronounced, death by hanging. He maintained his innocence to the end, at least publicly, and was returned to Usk jail to await execution. The lives behind the crime, a post-trial reflection. After the verdict, newspapers began to look beyond the courtroom and into the lives that had led to the tragedy at St Mellons. What emerged was not a story of a born villain and his unsuspecting victim, but something far more human. A slow, tragic narrowing of choices for two people whose paths should never have crossed. Susan Ann Ingram, born in Jersey in 1831, was by every account a gentle, cultivated woman. She spent more than a decade in the service of respectable families, often regarded less as a servant and more as a trusted companion. Well read, quietly devout, and fond of children, she had hoped to save enough to open a small lodging house of her own. When she met the young footman James Henry Gibbs, she was nearly 40 and unused to affection. Her friends later said she loved not wisely but too well, and the intense loyalty she showed him made her blind to his failings. Gibbs, by contrast, began life with no obvious darkness in him. Born in 1851, he was delicate, earnest, and studious. His early employers spoke well of him. He rose steadily from errand boy to butler, but his character bent under one flaw that grew more dangerously with time, a habit of dishonesty born first from pride, then fear, and finally the desperate need to maintain two incompatible lives. The Cardiff Times traced how this moral erosion unfolded. After quarrelling with Susan in 1871, he tried to rebuild himself in Wales, only to become entangled almost immediately with Mary Jones, a young woman of his own age, at St Mellons. While courting her, he secretly resumed correspondence with Susan, telling each woman a version of himself that could not survive daylight. By the spring of 1874, his lies had hardened into a trap. Servants at the hall suspected he was married. The Jones family were preparing for a wedding, and Susan, increasingly distressed by his neglect, made several anxious journeys to confront him. Visits the household noticed, and which he desperately tried to conceal. Newspapers later reported that Gibbs had, on more than one occasion, led Susan to remote places near marshes and watercourses, as if testing routes where she might disappear without witness. Their last meetings were marked by quarrels, tears, and Susan's growing fear. On the night she vanished, she told neighbours she felt a weight upon her mind, yet she still believed he meant at last to acknowledge her as his wife. After the trial, villagers constructed their own theory of what had happened. A confrontation near the drive, a blow that left her insensible, Gibbs returning to the hall, then slipping out again through the kitchen window with a razor, and the final act in the darkness beneath the briars. It remained only a theory, but it reflected the grim logic of the evidence and of Gibbs's life at that moment, tightening into panic. Llanrumney Hall itself offered no further explanation. The layout of its staircases, pantries, and side windows made it possible for Gibbs to enter unseen, hide the umbrella and bag, burn papers in his stove, and remove incriminating documents from his drawers, small actions that, pieced together at the trial, formed the quiet architecture of guilt. By the time the jury returned their verdict at Monmouth, the public had come to see Gibbs not simply as a murderer, but as a man who had allowed one lie to breed another until murder became, in his own mind, the only way to protect the life he wanted. Susan, meanwhile, appeared in these late reports not as a naive woman, but as someone whose affection, faith, and longing for a home of her own were tragically exploited. It was a Victorian crime in every sense: a secret marriage, a double life, a respectable household, and a murder carried out in darkness on the edges of a quiet Welsh parish. James Henry Gibbs was executed at Usk Jail on Monday the 24th of August 1874, condemned for the wilful murder of his wife, Susan Ann Gibbs. He maintained his innocence to the last, speaking little in his final hours, and meeting his fate with the same quiet reserve that had marked him throughout his confinement. By noon that day, word of the execution had reached Cardiff and Newport, closing a case that had gripped the district for an entire summer. And so ends the shocking St Mellons mystery, a tale of secret lives, desperate lies, and a tragedy hidden beneath the briars. And it's still reminding us of how fragile justice could be in the Victorian age. Further particulars. And in the spirit of Victorian newspapers, who so often balanced accounts of the darkest crimes with decidedly lighter curiosities, we close today's episode with a small but spirited item from the summer of 1874, when the city of Bath found itself quite undone by a parrot. From the Bath Chronicle and Weekly Gazette, the 18th of July, 1874, an extraordinary commotion at Bath. A travelling draper's parrot causes alarming disturbance at the Grand Hotel. Bath, on Friday, an incident of a singular and somewhat amusing character occasioned no little excitement yesterday evening at the Grand Hotel, and afforded the habituates of the pump room a welcome topic for animated discussion. It appears that Mr. Horace Pemberton, a travelling draper well known for his delicate nerves and genteel manners, reported the disappearance of what he termed his precious companion, giving rise to the gravest apprehensions among both guests and staff. Fears of an abduction were whispered in the corridors, and before long Stall Street police were summoned. Inspector Hargreaves responded with a commendable promptitude, was assured upon arrival that no crime of a violent nature had been committed. Mr. Pemberton's companion proved not to be a young lady as first assumed, but a Norwegian blue parrot, of which the gentleman appears inordinately fond. The bird, having forced open its cage, is believed to have made a hasty escape following an altercation with the chambermaid, Miss Alice Withers, who received a slight wound to the wrist while attempting to restore order. The parrot, undeterred by its mischief, subsequently took flight from an ornamental balcony and eluded all attempts at capture. A crowd soon assembled outside the building, where numerous onlookers swore they had observed the creature perched aloft upon the statue of Beau Nash, delivering spirited commentary to several unimpressed pigeons. After some delay, the vagrant bird was successfully retrieved and returned to its distressed owner, who expressed profound gratitude to all concerned. In consequence of the disturbance, the management of the Grand Hotel has posted a discreet notice reminding guests that parrots must be securely housed before supper. Ah, I see the red velvet-coated ferrets have emerged from the wings again, tapping their little pocket watches and making increasingly pointed hand gestures that suggest I have been talking too long. Which can only mean one thing. So ends this episode of the St Mellons Inconvenient Wife. If any of this has been more diverting than reorganising your cutlery drawer by philosophical era, please do press anything that looks vaguely hopeful. It reassures the Moriarty adjacent algorithm that we should not be locked in the naughty cupboard with the 1982 VCR machines. And if you fancy exploring our Patreon station, it is thoroughly stocked with documentaries and 5 exclusive series you won't find anywhere else. The sort of thing Victorian newspapers might have called edifying, peculiar, and not entirely advisable. We'd love to see you there. This has been News of the Times, and I am Robin Coles, keen amateur cartographer of Victorian misdeeds and licensed custodian of abandoned teapots and part-time negotiator with malfunctioning desk lamps. And finally, could someone please give the fridge a firm thump? It's humming again, which in this house is rarely a good sign. Until next time. Same News of the Time, same News of the Time channel.